Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome all those who are joining us on our heritage.org website and other networks that are broadcasting today. We would ask everyone here in-house if you'll check that cell phones have been turned off. It will be appreciated as we prepare to begin. And, of course, our Internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And we will post the program on the Heritage homepage following for your future reference as well. Hosting our discussion today is Hella Dale, Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. She focuses on the U.S. government's institutions and programs for strategic outreach to the public of foreign countries as well as more traditional diplomacy. She is a media fellow at the Hoover Institution. She also serves on the Board of Visitors of the Institute on Political Journalism and the Center for Free Inquiry at Hanover College in Indiana. Please join me in welcoming Hella Dale. Hella?
Thank you, John, and welcome today to our event on the Russian dirty tricks and propaganda campaign, which we have seen in full bloom in recent months, relating to specifically Russia's efforts to dominate and control parts of its former Soviet empire. As we look at a highly unstable situation in eastern Ukraine and presidential elections coming up in May, these efforts by Russia, I think we can all say, can be trusted to intensify. The Russian actions against Crimea and eastern Ukraine have awoken the world to Vladimir Putin's determined efforts to recreate past Russian influence. For this, he is using every means at his disposal, going well beyond military power. The new Russian propaganda ministry has ramped up anti-American rhetoric to a fever pitch. Foreign news sources are being blocked, pro-Russian NGOs are being established throughout the former republics, and Russian ethnic minorities in neighboring states are bombarded with Russian language media from Moscow. Beyond that, in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, Russian special intelligence units are igniting separatist interests. Meanwhile, from the American perspective, and this should say it all, we have Secretary of State John Kerry and Vice President Joe Biden spearheading U.S. support for Ukraine. If you don't find that terribly confidence-inspiring, then I am with you. We have today with us three truly eminent experts on Russia and the Soviet Union, keen observers of Russian behavior past and present. Our first speaker will be John Lenchowski. He is the founder and president of the Institute of World Politics. From 1991 to 1993, he served in the State Department in the Bureau of European Affairs. 81 to 83, yes. And from 83 to 87, he was director of European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council. In that capacity, he served as the principal Soviet affairs advisor to President Reagan. He has been associated with many academic and research institutions, but he is certainly here best known as the founder of the Institute on World Politics on 16th Street, an eminent school of foreign policy studies, a graduate school which has spearheaded many of the efforts on strategic communication, public diplomacy, and studies of foreign propaganda. So welcome to John. We're absolutely thrilled you're here with us today.
Thank you very much, Hella. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to be with my colleagues, Ariel Cohen and Paul Goebel. I have great admiration for them, and maybe we have too much of a society of mutual adoration up here, but anyway, Hella has asked me if I would give a little bit of a background about Russian propaganda, or perhaps also Soviet propaganda, and how some of the themes and ways and means of this propaganda relate to what is going on today. there is a long tradition, obviously, in the 20th century that the Soviets perfected to a science, and they had an entire spectrum of activities that went from ordinary conventional public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, sports diplomacy, and all sorts of things like that that were designed for purposes of psychological disarmament, to ordinary information policy, which was heavily manipulated, mixing the truth with lies, and using the truth where it served their purposes and twisting it in classic propagandistic fashion. This spectrum went on into the whole field of active measures, which was the KGB term of art referring to disinformation, forgeries, and covert political influence operations. And these involved all sorts of things such as provocations, front organizations, the agents of influence that were placed in foreign newspapers, in foreign parliaments, and in foreign governments. There were a number of, given that the KGB may have been split up into a couple of different organizations but never really reformed, and given that the KGB was heavily involved in these types of active measures operations, there's a tremendous institutional memory within Russia today about how this was done during Soviet days. Unfortunately, we have stopped tracking these kinds of things in the U.S. government. In the 80s, when I was serving there, we had a Soviet active measures working group which collected, where not only our intelligence community but our diplomatic community collected information about Soviet disinformation themes and how they were related both to covert influence operations and to ordinary propaganda. We studied what we had picked up. We declassified the information which we had analyzed. We disseminated it to other government agencies, to editorial boards, to foreign governments, in order to sensitize people of what the Soviets were doing. And the very exposure of this type of activity was something that raised people's consciousness and enabled them to realize the degree to which their perceptions were being managed. One of the great problems that I've had with the way U.S. foreign policy is run and the way people study it, which is one of the motivations for our founding the Institute of World Politics, is that very few people study propaganda or covert political influence operations. And therefore, they don't know the history or the techniques by which perceptions management can be accomplished. And so I simply ask, how do you know you are perceiving foreign reality correctly if you don't know how your perceptions could be managed by any number of actors, friends, or foes? This is an essential subject for the study of international relations, and I think it is a sign of huge both professional and academic malpractice that this is a subject that has been so systematically ignored, except in the few corridors around the country like ours at IWP that study these things. I wanted briefly to review a couple of the classic methods of Soviet propaganda and disinformation which have been carried on by the Russians in the modern era. And let me just say, we in the United States, not having collected information on this, nor having studied this in any systematic fashion, have been blissfully unaware about the degree to which this has affected our perceptions. But there are others, for example, in neighboring countries, and not least of which is Ukraine, where people who living there are very familiar with Soviet active measures, now Russian active measures, and who were in the business of, and who actually exposed some of these things, charged the Russians for doing these things, and this was long before these recent events. We were hearing Ukrainian accusations against Russia concerning active measures back in the early, mid, and late 1990s. One of the most essential elements of Russian strategy and Soviet strategy is to define the terms of debate. Any good debater knows that he who defines the terms of debate is halfway towards winning it. And what has the Soviets did this in all sorts of classic fashion. They were for peace, we were for war, they were for disarmament, we were for arms race, they were for security, we were aggressors who were creating insecurity, etc., etc. Well, they are doing the same thing today by identifying the Ukrainian new government as fascists and Nazis, of course blackening the image of their opponents as a standard operating procedure, and saying that this is ultimately a battle between them, the good guys, the anti-Nazis, and the Nazi fascists in Kiev. In the Crimean referendum, there were signs saying, basically laying this conflict out as Russia versus the Nazis. A large part of this effort involves distracting people's attention from the issue at hand. Distraction is a huge element of propaganda, and one of the ways that Russian propaganda has been doing this, especially insofar as the United States has been involved, has been to accuse us of illegally invading Iraq, of attempting to co-opt all sorts of people around the world who questioned the legality and the prudence of our invasion of Iraq. In any event, there are other kinds of themes like that, but suffice it to say that this is one of the major elements. They accuse their adversaries of doing exactly what they do, namely covert action. They're accusing us of it. They're accusing Kiev of covert action in the east, when it is precisely their own provocateurs who have been involved in infiltrating the country and engaging in these types of riling up demonstrations and so on and so forth, staged protests. The semantics are another key technique in all of this. I can only say that one of the elements in this, and there are many different dimensions. You may have seen some recent reports about the use of Novorossiya as a region of southern and eastern Ukraine, as it was called during Tsarist times, which they're claiming to be Russian territory. Then there are certain other themes. One of them is that Moscow is paranoid. This was a classic Soviet strategic deception theme. It is designed to get everybody in the West to believe that we have to handle Moscow with kid gloves. We cannot provoke them too much. We cannot resist what they're doing, or else it will provoke them and make things worse. And then there is the effort to try to co-opt sympathizers among the enemy. And what's remarkable is the degree to which Putin's cynical defense of Christendom and traditional moral values, anti-LGBT campaign, and all of this sort of thing has managed to attract all sorts of social conservatives, not only in the United States, but particularly in Europe. Let me just say make a couple of, there's so much more about these themes that can be said, and I'm sure that my colleagues will say a number of them, will address a number of them. I would like to deal very briefly with what the United States should do. As I mentioned before, I think it is essential that that we as a government and that our even academic institutions and think tanks do more analysis of this field. I'm absolutely delighted that the Heritage Foundation has seen fit to have this forum to cast some light on this issue. This is a classic issue that shouldn't just be reserved for crisis moments. It's something that goes on all the time in so many of the different conflicts around the world, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's radical Islamism, whether it's China. These are fertile fields for analysis. The next thing I think the United States has to do is have a voice of truth. We have shut down so many of our public diplomacy capabilities in this country. We shut down the United States Information Agency in what I call a bipartisan fit of absence of mind in 1999. I think that it was all supposed to be very efficient, and we were going to we folded a shadow of USIA's former capabilities into the Department of State, where it remains an orphan child. Yes, we do some public diplomacy out of the State Department, but it is ignored. It is not something that is your ticket to becoming an Assistant Secretary of State. We have a diplomatic culture in this country and not a serious soft power culture. I would venture to say that the U.S. Army has a greater sensitivity to soft power than the Department of State does. It understands hearts and minds operations, having recognized the vital necessity of these sorts of things on the battlefronts in Iraq and Afghanistan. It understands cultural diplomacy and it understands it to be a more strategic instrument of American power. We have a huge part of this is the problem of our international broadcasts. Our international broadcasts, radio, television, and obviously internet, are the only unfiltered information that we can get into the minds of millions and millions of people around the world. All other information that we transmit is filtered by the governments that control their media, as does Russia, to this extraordinary extent that it has started to do. We have shut down Voice of America, Russian and Ukrainian broadcasts over shortwave. We barely had an imprint on an AM station. For I don't know what the reason was why the BBG was not able to renew even the little AM station that we had in Moscow, but a subcontractor of the BBG failed to renew the contract, and then Putin basically shut the thing down. I don't know where the responsibility lies. In any event, the BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which runs the VOA, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, Television Al Hura, Radio Marti, Radio Sawa, Radio Farda, etc., Radio Free Asia, is a dysfunctional agency which has a bipartisan board of unpaid volunteer commissioners who come only part-time and who exercise executive authority. This board, and the Secretary of State is a member of this board, but is effectively in absentia. The result is that the bureaucracy there is effectively unaccountable. This is a board that does not report to anybody when it comes to the foreign policy, to being consistent with, in the case of the Voice of America, VOA broadcasts have to be consistent with the foreign policy of the United States. The surrogate radios, the freedom radios that serve a separate mission from the Voice of America, like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, act as a surrogate domestic free press for countries denied free media. And these are entirely separate missions. They are worthy of both of them of being pursued. They're extremely cheap. The BBG tried to shut down all broadcasts to China in Mandarin and in Cantonese on the grounds that shortwave is an obsolete legacy technology. Why then did Beijing buy 290 shortwave transmitters in the last couple of years? Because shortwave is Beijing's favorite and only most effective method of communicating with its own people. Shortwave gets to the audience. You can listen to radio anonymously. All of this, of course, was these radio broadcasts and TV broadcasts have been incrementally junked by the BBG as if everybody is going to be on the internet, and as if there aren't millions of internet police in a place like China, and as if these internet sites can't be blocked or the entire web can't be shut down. In any event, we have to start getting serious about getting an alternative voice out there in the world, an entire overhaul of strategic communications. And my solution for this is to make the VOA and the freedom radios, the surrogate radios, and television stations have their own independent directors that report ultimately to the White House, to the National Security Council. There are different ways of structuring this, and reasonable people can disagree, but they have to be accountable. I also believe that we should set up a new U.S. public diplomacy agency where we fold in all of the public diplomacy functions of the U.S. government into one big empire, and so that they would ultimately be taken seriously in this agency. I believe that 50% of all ambassadorships should come out of that agency, and then people would start taking public diplomacy seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you for that intervention on behalf of U.S. public diplomacy. And I know that there are lots of talks about reform efforts in this field, and maybe one of these next few days or months we will have another meeting here at Heritage to talk about all that is going on in that sphere. Now let me introduce our next speaker, Paul Goebel, who also at the moment I believe is a guest lecturer at the Institute on World Politics, but that is not by any means his only reason for being here. Paul Goebel is a longtime specialist on ethnic and religious questions in Eurasia. He has served as director and dean in various capacities at the Azerbaijan Diplomatic Academy. He has been associated with the Audentes University in Tallinn and at the Euro College in the University of Tartu in Estonia. He also launched a Euro Window on Eurasia series there. Prior to joining the faculty in Estonia, he worked for various parts of the U.S. government, the State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, the International Broadcasting Bureau, as well as Voice of America, Radio for Europe, and Radio Liberty. He has frequently worked on ethnic and religious issues and has been an advisor to the governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania during their strive for independence from the Soviet Union. So he is extremely well qualified to give us that point of view. Paul, over to you.
Thank you. Hella has asked me to speak about the fraught relationship between Moscow and ethnic Russians outside of the Russian Federation, and I will do that. But I cannot resist adding to John Lenchowski's very insightful comments that those of you who are going to become interested in the issue of countering what the Russians are doing in the propaganda and disinformation wars need to remember the name Natalie Grant, who was America's leading specialist on disinformation in the past and whose works continue to be important. She said three things which are relevant to our discussion today. The first, she said, is the worst problem in international relations is that everyone tries to project on others what they are themselves. It is not only a problem that the Russians do it, it's everyone do it, and we tend not to see it when we do it ourselves. The way this was summarized by Natalie years ago was the U.S. sends the Soviet Union diplomats, and they treat them like spies. We send the Soviet Union, or we send diplomats, and they treat them as spies. They send us spies, and we treat them as diplomats. I mean, this is a problem. The second is that the problem is, in fact, far worse than many people think. Most of the statements that Vladimir Putin and his friends make today are outright lies. Lies are fairly easy to counter. There's a much more serious threat in the case of disinformation. As Natalie wrote some years ago, disinformation is mostly true. That is to say that you create a set of expectations, and then you introduce one or two falsehoods, and that has enormous consequences, and that requires enormous resources to find out. It's easy to deal with these blatant lies, but do not think that the blatant lies are the only challenge out there. And third, as Natalie Grant wrote, dealing with the question of disinformation and efforts to influence, one has to realize that this is a long-term problem, that you cannot dip in and dip out of it. The United States is increasingly short-term in its approach, and that means that we come in and we don't see what's been going on, and we don't understand how much we have been manipulated already by having ignored the first 4.5 acts of a 5-act play. What is going on in eastern Ukraine today is nothing especially new in some regards. In other ways, it is a serious change, and I want to talk about that. One of the saddest things I have ever seen was an Estonian television report in August 1998 when the Russian ruble collapsed at the end of Yeltsin's time. And you will remember that because the ruble was collapsing, citizens of the Russian Federation rushed to spend their rubles so that they would have goods because the ruble wouldn't be worth anything. The tragedy was that in northeastern Estonia, in the city of Narva, there were ethnic Russians, or Russian speakers, who were rushing to the stores to buy goods with hard Estonian krones because they had been watching Russian television and did not make the distinction between the Estonian currency, which was a hard currency, and the Russian currency, which had collapsed. This is not unimportant, because very often even reporting which may be accurate has consequences when it is put in a new context that people are not paying attention to. I'd like to very quickly cover 3 things with you. First, I'd like to say something about the tragedy which is inherent in the Russian state and the Russian people, and has been for at least 700 years, which goes to the issue of who is Russian and who is not. Second, I want to focus specifically on why Moscow approached the so-called ethnic Russians in the, quote, near abroad, unquote, between 1991 and 2010 one way, and why Vladimir Putin has made a bet in the other direction now. Because in some respects, what Putin has done is to violate even the rules of the game that Moscow had sort of accepted after the settlement of the end of the Soviet Union. And third, I'd like to make 4 or 5 comments at the end, violating my usual Trinity approach, on what we've got to do and do now, and that we have certain capacities that we can run up very rapidly, and there are other things that we had better be ready for if we care about the future. Okay, the tragedy of the Russian people and the Russian state can be expressed in a single sentence, and that is that the Russian state became an empire before the Russian people became a nation. That has an enormous number of consequences, one of which, of course, is that it means that the Russian state has never been a nation state. It's always been an imperial one. And on the other hand, it means that ethnic Russians or Russians have always been defined by the state rather than defining themselves. When we say ethnic Russian, we act as if we are talking about a category which is at the same level, ontologically, as the category of the Irish or the Germans or the French. That is simply not true. These are categories defined by the state, and it is defined by the state for very particular reasons. The second point is the first point is that the general proposition. The second is that the state has always defined ethnicity, has always defined who is a Russian and who is not. And one of the things that has been terribly important in the last few weeks is Vladimir Putin's people realize how weak Russian national identity is. If you have watched the desperate effort to speak about ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, pro-Russian people, it is a fact that Russian identity is extraordinarily weak. Russian national identity is far weaker than the national identities of any of the Central Asian nations. That is something that just will not be accepted by people in this city, because if you were trained as a Soviet specialist, you were trained as a Russian specialist. And in fact, you were trained as a Moscow specialist, which meant you only passed the ring road to get to Sheremetyevo Airport. Russian national identity is very weak because of a series of policies, first on the Empire, then under the Soviets, and more recently now. Under the Empire, the Tsars did everything they could, including never asking the question of your ethnicity in a census, never, not once, because they knew that the non-Russians were more numerous and that the Russian state did not have the capacity to hold the place together unless it kept the Russians from mobilizing as an ethnic community. Under the Soviets, there was a Faustian bargain in which ethnic Russians generally got to run things, but only at the price of denying they were doing it, which truncated Russian national development. Since '91, the Russian Federation has been, I would argue still is, but has been seriously compromised in its ability to allow the emergence of ethnic Russian identity, because a Russian nation state inside the Russian Federation is the quickest way to do two things, both of which the Kremlin doesn't want. The first is the destruction of the Russian Federation, which is almost a third now non-Russian, so that if you get Russian nationalism at home, you will get the end of the Russian Federation. And second, if you allow Russian nationalism to develop, not only will you develop non-Russian nationalism, but you will require the kind of state authority, the authoritarianism that will preclude economic development. That was the trap the Soviet Union found itself in the 70s and 80s, when it had to choose between stability and development. We know that under Brezhnev they chose stability, under Gorbachev they tried to choose development, and it all came apart. That problem hasn't gone away. And there is a third element here which I think is critical, and that is the Russian Federation government, including Vladimir Putin, are terrified about something which we need to talk about, namely that the ethnic Russian community, however you want to define it, has ceased to be an assimilating nation and is being assimilated by others and breaking into fragments. What that means, of course, is that if you don't get an authoritarian state, and Putin thinks he can outlast that with oil and gas revenue, what you're going to watch is there isn't going to be a Russian nation. There are going to be Siberians, there are going to be Ingermanlanders, and the ethnic Russians outside of the Russian Federation, the subject, my primary subject, are going to drift away. It is only the willingness of people in Moscow and the West to accept the idea that language and identity are the same that gets us from Russian speakers to ethnic Russian to people who are loyal to Moscow. That's just simply untrue. In Soviet times, there was a great joke. What do you call people who speak 3 languages, trilingual? What do you call people who speak 2 languages, bilingual? What do you call someone who speaks 1 language, an American? And the problem is that we bring this to the table and we think language is identity. Nonsense. If you look around the world, you will see many, many national movements that took off when people stopped speaking the language of the empire or started speaking it, and it goes in a variety of ways. It doesn't all work the way. Now, when the Soviet Union came apart, second part, when the Soviet Union came apart in 1991, there was great expectation among people in the West and some in Moscow, that the roughly 25.4 million ethnic Russians in the 11 former Soviet republics and 3 formerly occupied Baltic countries would become the modern equivalent of the Volksdeutsch. They would be people that Moscow would reach out to. Didn't happen. Amazingly, it didn't happen. Why? Well, there were 2 reasons, I think, one domestic and one foreign. If you had promoted a Russian nationalist strategy at home, you would have led to the further disintegration of the Russian Federation, because you would have promoted Russian nationalism at home that the state under Boris Yeltsin could not have contained. The second is that it was a view of the Yeltsin government, people like Kozyrev and their advisors, people like Tishkov, that the only way that Russia could have influence in the neighborhood was by promoting good relations with the governments which were headed by titular nationalities. Promoting ethnic Russian nationalism among these non-Russian groups, guess what would that do? Well, it would be viewed as an unfriendly act, as I can testify Estonians and Latvians view that as an unfriendly act to this day. Consequently, despite a lot of talk about it, Moscow did relatively little to play the ethnic card, except in Estonia and Latvia, between 91 and 2010, relatively little. But there was a third reason that matters even more. Most of these people did not see themselves as ethnic Russian the way we want to see them as an ethnic Russians, as members of a coherent national community. Instead, they saw themselves as speakers of a language. And because their identity had been defined by the state, if the Russian state was weak and somebody else was offering a better deal, that's what you should take. I have a picture of a demonstration in Pskov Oblast, which is the westernmost oblast of the Russian Federation, from about 7 years ago, showing a group of Russians in Pskov Oblast marching around with signs on which it is said, "I'd rather be a second-class citizen in Estonia than a first-class citizen in the Russian Federation." And these people were ethnic Russians, okay? Now, what Vladimir Putin has done, because he has understood that if the only way you can promote a tighter Russian nationalism that flows from that original proposition I said is with authoritarianism. And he believes he has the capacity to do that. But what he has now done, and this is the real crime in Crimea and Ukraine, it is the crime that he must be opposed and that we must bring him ultimately, I believe, to The Hague. And that is that he is the first leader of a major country since 1945 who has said that ethnicity, as he understands it, is more important than citizenship. That is destructive of any possible international order. And it is something that is dangerous to the neighbors of Russia. It is dangerous to Russia itself because it will lead to its explosion. And it's dangerous to the rest of the world because it will be copied. If you allow the principle to go unchallenged, as we seem to be, unfortunately, that ethnicity is more, that citizenship is not the defining thing. What you will get is the ethnization of foreign policy, and it will become increasingly violent. Crimea must, I believe, be a new 911 for us. It must wake us up. In '91, we decided the end of history had happened and we could simply ignore the rest of the world. In 2001, we bought into the idea that there were still bad things, but we assumed they were all sub-state actors. What Crimea should be a reminder of is that there are evil things in the world, and some of them are in states. But the idea that the ethnic Russians abroad are a coherent group is not true. It's not only that they're different between ethnic Russians who live in Uzbekistan and ethnic Russians who live in Estonia and ethnic Russians who live in Ukraine. There are enormous differences. But the important thing to keep in mind is that those people are disappearing. You may have seen the articles last week in Moscow saying, where are the 3 million ethnic Russians from Ukraine? You know, they've disappeared. Sure, they've decided that in their term of identity, they may speak Russian, but they are now identifying not only as Ukrainian citizens, but as members of a Ukrainian civic nation. And that's what happens when you have you make ethnic identity, as the Russian state has, dependent on state power. We can't afford to allow that to happen. What do I think we should do? Let me suggest, I guess I'll go back to 3 things. I like trinities, and that will keep me better in the 10 to 12 minutes I said I would. First, We have to recognize that the problem we face with Moscow is not simply Moscow's lies, not simply Moscow's disinformation directed at ethnic Russians abroad, but in the entire structure of that, and that reporting by Russian television to the neighboring countries is itself, even if it were accurate, it isn't always, but sometimes, sometimes they get something right, is by itself a subversive act, and therefore we have to support those governments, like Latvia and Lithuania, that have blocked the distribution of Russian state television as destabilizing. It's the first thing. Rather than condemning it as a violation of human rights, which I have heard from people in this town, we've got to support that. Second, we have to support, and with money, and also to provide political cover to the post-Soviet states to do something that is extraordinarily difficult for them to do and which they have been reluctant to do for obvious reasons. That is, they need to begin producing television and radio programming in Russian to make sure that the ethnic Russians on their territory do not just look at Moscow TV and listen to Moscow radio. I was asked by the Latvians whether they should shut down Moscow television. I said, absolutely, but that's not enough. What you need to do is to create a Latvian Russian language TV that the Russian speakers in Latvia would rather watch. That's an enormous task, but it's not impossible, and it is something that these governments can do if they enjoy the protection, the cover, if you like, that our support could provide. And third, we desperately need to expand, revive U.S. international broadcasting. We need to begin broadcasting immediately in Crimean Tatar, and we can do that. We had Crimean Tatar programming coming from Radio Liberty's Tatar Bashkir service until a couple of months ago. They've got the people, they can do it. We've got to revive shortwave as a halfway house before we can get up to speed to do direct-to-home television programming. Third point under that, we have got to stop buying into Russian definitions of where we broadcast. In the history of U.S. international broadcasting, the United States has never, not once, except for one time, broadcast to a region of how Moscow defined and divided up the place with other languages. That one exception was in 1986, when briefly the United States broadcast in Ukrainian to the Far East, to the Russian Far East. You may know that in the Russian Far East, there are roughly 3 to 5 million ethnic Ukrainians. That broadcasting was done from Japan. It should be done again. It should be, and that's not the only place, but I'd be happy to talk about where you can do that. We should be taking the battle right back to Moscow, and we should be broadcasting in a whole bunch of languages that you maybe haven't heard of recently, like Buryat, as well as expanding the Tatars and the Bashkir broadcast and Chuvash and so on. And last point, we have to understand that we have re-entered a world which too many people in this city thought had permanently been put to bed, and that is we are now dealing with denied areas. There are places where it's simply extraordinarily difficult to get information. Where areas are denied, where it is difficult to get information, and the internet doesn't solve everything, despite the mantra of some people at 22nd and C. You need real expertise. You need to spend the time gathering things. I was privileged to work in the research department at Radio Liberty, and I can tell you how much time it took when these were denied areas to find things. But those are the only kinds of broadcasts that make sense. You cannot trump that, you cannot short-circuit that by assuming that you can get it all off the internet. Now, that is going to require us not only to restore a research function which we can't slough off to universities. It just simply isn't going to be possible because you have a real-time problem. But it's critically important to overcome one of our limits. Besides looking at my picture of the scoff Russians demonstrating to become second-class citizens of Estonia, each morning I think of one other thing which I have pasted over my computer screen. In 1944, Winston Churchill observed to the American ambassador that the Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. That was a wonderful possibility in 1944 and 45 when the United States had half of the world's GDP. Now that we're down to 20% and headed to 10% within this decade, we have to be smart and clever because we cannot afford to be wrong with the assumption that we can always catch up. If we do not do something to challenge what Moscow is trying to do, we will watch a much more vicious, much more violent war, and we will watch a much more rapid disintegration of a variety of states, including the Russian Federation. What Moscow is doing in Crimea will ultimately destroy the Russian Federation. That story needs to be told, but it will destroy a bunch of other countries too, like those with overseas Chinese, like those where language and identity are confused. We need to be clear about that. We need to understand that the people around Putin are lying, but they also misunderstand what it's about. Putin is doing this to justify an authoritarian regime. But just as the Soviet Union died, not because Gorbachev liberalized, but because Gorbachev turned to the right, the Russian Federation will die, not because there was progress in the right direction in the 90s and to a lesser extent since that time, but because of a turn in the other direction. The challenge was in the Cold War was never just communism. It was Soviet-Russian imperialism in Europe. And we are watching Russian imperialism once again, misusing categories, misusing information, and if we don't counter it now, we will have to counter it there. Very last observation. The strength of this country has always been in its soft power, in its ideas and its influence, far more than its military strength or its economic power. The United States wins when it plays a soft power game cleverly. It loses when it's put in a relatively more uncomfortable and less advantageous situation where it will have to rely on hard power. If we do not promote soft power through broadcasting, through public diplomacy, we will eventually be driven to use hard power, and it will cost far more, be far more difficult, and far more dangerous to our goals and our interests as well as everyone else's. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And our final speaker has a lot to digest here. Ariel Cohen is the Heritage Senior Research Fellow in Russian and Eurasian Studies and International Energy Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. He joined the Heritage Foundation in 1992 and has earned his doctorate from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Massachusetts. Served as a consultant to both the executive branch and the private sector on policy towards Russia, Eastern and Central Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. He is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute on Strategic Studies in London, and the Association for the Study of Nationalities. Ariel has also appeared on numerous television and in print media in Russia, here, everywhere. Ariel, your take on this. You wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Helle. Both John Lenchovsky and Paul Goebel, as you know and could hear, are a difficult act to follow. But I'll try. To me, it's deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra said, because I started in Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe Audience Research. I continued with a master's paper at the Fletcher School, a master thesis on front organizations as a tool of Soviet power projection in the Third World, and wrote my PhD on Russian imperialism, development, and crisis. So all these pieces are coming now together, and I feel young again. When you listen to the rhetoric coming out of Russia, such as Russia is raising from its knees, such as blaming the political opposition as national предатели, national traitors. You shudder and you wonder where this come from. This is reminiscent very much of the 1930s rhetoric of the darkest ages. At the same time, Russian propagandists such as Andronik Migranyan, the head of the Russian-funded Institute of Democracy and something else based out of New York, writes an op-ed in Izvestia calling Hitler until 1939 as a brilliant politician, and his counterpart, Vyacheslav Nikonov, the grandson of Vyacheslav Molotov, says that, quote, the Aryan Slavic tribes came down the Caspian Mountains and conquered the space between the Baltic and the Pacific. And nothing happens. They're not shut down like the RAIN TV station, like some of the websites that have been shut down, Kasparov.ru and others. And I guess the political opposition should be happy. I spent yesterday reading the transcript of the 5-hour Vladimir Putin equivalent of Allo Presidente, that was the genre that was pioneered by the late Hugo Chavez, the call-in and the SMS questions. And Putin said, what do these people want? They're not thrown in the camp like in 1937. So I guess they should count their blessings. When you are encountering this new political environment, new notions, some of which were mentioned here, such as Novorossiya, the new Russia, to describe 100+ years later the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. This terminology was indeed used in the Imperial Russia, such as describing essentially the national liberal and nationalist forces that overthrew President Yanukovych as fascists, and blurring of the notions of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians, whereas clearly warning the Russian nationalists and ultranationalists in the same Allo Presidente, same 5-hour Q&A, that Russian people had absorbed many genetic brands or strains, said Mr. Putin, so that no blood ethnicity should be allowed, because that is very dangerous. When you are dealing with this new environment, you also have to look at what are the terminology and notions that are being used as propaganda notions and pieces. For example, what is really federalization of Ukraine? Federalization of Ukraine is rendering Ukraine impotent as a nation state. It is dictating a constitutional change to a neighboring country, and I'm wondering what would federalization mean for Russia itself. As Nabokov wrote, people who live in glass houses should not throw stones, because if people in Chechnya and Dagestan and Yakutia, that produces a good chunk of the world diamond production, Yamal Nenets, that produces a lot of oil and gas, and others, will start to federalize and control their revenue, such as Mr. Putin suggests for their Ukrainian brethren and neighbors, the Russian Federation will not look very good. What are the channels that these new notions are being distributed through? Of course, it's Russian media, but it's a new Russian media. We remember that RIA Novosti, the Russian information agency that was reformed and ran for 10 years by Svetlana Mironuk, underwent a massive change with the appointment of a new leader, a man who, for example, in the same call-in, said that he feels that Russia is strangulated, to which Mr. Putin responded, "Don't worry, we can strangulate anybody." So sort of a leery debate there, a chilling debate. But this is an example of how a notion of Russia under siege is being used and promoted by the propagandists. We have Russia Today as a television channel in English, Spanish, and Arabic. Note, there's no Russia Today in Chinese, because the Chinese told the Russians they don't want Russia Today in Chinese, and Russia obliged. Russia Today is a channel through which these notions are distributed around the world. The legitimacy of Ukrainian state is totally undermined. Mr. Putin said twice in his Q&A that he sees the new government of Ukraine as illegitimate, that by implication Yanukovych is still the legitimate president, and again that people who are fighting for separating eastern and southern Ukraine from the rest of Ukraine are locals, when it is very clear by the way they bear themselves, by the kind of night scopes and infrared night scopes and silencers they carry on their rifles. These are special forces. And Mr. Putin made a distinction that in Crimea, yes, there were special forces, which at the time they denied. Now they're saying in eastern Ukraine, it's not special forces. These are little green men or local activists who could buy these infrared night scopes, of course, in every local hardware store. Another tactic that Russia is using is that the local separatists are putting women and children in front of them, and a Ukrainian commentator compared that with the tactic used in Gaza by Hamas or used in Hezbollah, when you put human shields, women and children, on rooftops or in front of schools and then shoot rockets into Israel from these sites. And then, of course, if Israelis respond, they may cause civilian casualties. And this is what these local activists are taught or instructed to do, so that there will be casualties allegedly caused by the Ukrainians. There's a broader litany of complaints against the United States that are repeatedly articulated by Russian spokespeople. These are accusations that there's no international monetary policy controls over the US dollar, and therefore US dollar has no right to be an international currency, that US violated international law, as John Lenchovsky mentioned, not just in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Serbia, I forgot where else, but that we are the main violator of international law, that NATO enlargement is aimed at Russia, that missile defense in Europe is aimed at Russia, and therefore the United States and the West, broadly defined and almost defined out of its legitimacy because of our liberal policies that the Russians and Russian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchy rejects. We are not essentially a legitimate civilization. It is very much in terms of the Huntingtonian clash of civilizations, in terms of a conspiracy, global conspiracy theory, in which the world is not ruled by elected governments, but by intelligence services and other conspiracies, be it Masons, bankers, Rockefellers, Rothschilds, etc. That is a propaganda narrative you find in many, many contemporary Russian sources, and among leading Russian ideologists such as Alexander Dugin. And for those of you who did not read Dugin or have not heard about Dugin, I strongly recommend anything that man generates just to see, A, how bizarre some of these conspiracy theories are, B, to recognize that Dugin is consistently occupying positions as an advisor to Duma chairman, starting with the communist Seleznov and currently with General Naryshkin, the current chairman of the Duma, Speaker of the Duma. So these conspiracy theories have one problem with them. And the problem is not that they're wrong. The problem is that people who promulgate them start to believe in them themselves. And then the policy is built on these conspiracy theories. To conclude, what can we do? First, of course, I agree with my colleagues. We need to pay much, much more attention. We have to have systematic study of Russian propaganda and the tools that are used to disseminate it. And for the life of me, I do not understand. And I'm the first one to support freedom of the press, freedom of expression, etc. But I don't understand how the Russian government shuts down the Voice of America, creates a lot of problems for the radio liberty. And we have something like 100 journalists here on New York Avenue from Russia Today. And Russia Today is a channel that they can invite you, and if you're foolish enough to come and speak, as I was, then they shout you down. And for me, that no more. Thank you very much. I'm not doing Russia Today again. Secondly, we need to, yet again, and I'm afraid I'm sounding like a broken record because I'm here in this organization for 21 years, and I'm saying we need to reform the VOA, we need to reform international broadcasting, we need to reform BBG, and it's nothing happening. It just keeps hobbling along like a three-legged cat. And we need to rethink it. We need to decide if we want it as a separate agency, which I probably think we need in terms of public diplomacy and international broadcasting, or we need some kind of a dotted line between the state and that. There were, what was Khrushchev's favorite term? Harebrained schemes of launching a Pentagon information operations outfit. That collapsed within about a week. But we need to recognize that the other side, as Paul, I think, said, you said that we think the Russians think like us. The Russians think that information is a part of something called information operations, which start with computers and hacking and disseminating messages that will mess the opponent up and interfere with the battlefield management. And then everything else is just a corollary of that. So we need to understand how the Russian information warfare theory works. We cannot tolerate, I think, the spokespeople that are implanted on our soil who praise Hitler, like Mr. Migranyan. What is he doing here and why is he here? I frankly do not understand. And we need to hire political dissidents for our surrogate broadcasting. We did it very successfully in the 70s, 80s, and before that, they did a terrific job on Radio Liberty. Anybody from Alexander Galich to you name it. And we have, unfortunately, a situation where we have, again, political exiles from Russia, and they could do a terrific job being international broadcasters. So I don't know if this administration is going to do it or the next administration is going to do it. This is a huge undertaking. You cannot do it on the cheap. What we need to do it is an important part of our survival, of our foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's give our panel a big hand of applause. for some great presentations and lots of thoughts, which I think we will be taking up. This is almost an invitation to having another public lecture on what we can do from our end to follow up. Right now, I'd like to invite the audience to bring up their questions to the panel. We'll have a couple of roving microphones, I hope, and I'd like to identify yourselves by name and affiliation. I know that there are a number of people here from our broadcasting services and people who have been involved in the past, so I know it will be a lively discussion. We're going to start over here in the corner. Someone I know will have a strong opinion.
Good morning, I'm Blanquita Cullum, and I served on the Broadcasting Board of Governors for 8 years. And in some cases, I will have to say it was a great honor and a pleasure to serve our country and those amazing journalists that represent our country. I do agree with many of the things that you have said about fixing the Broadcasting Board of Governors. The problem, I would tell you, is kind of a bit complicated, and I'll try to be short and to the point. First of all, you have to really understand what's going on. The governors that serve, they serve at the pleasure of the president. They are paid when they serve. They have to respond to the concern of the United States Senate and House of Representatives of what's going on. On the other hand, they do meet monthly, but many of us who lived here met more frequently. And the bottom line is they rely on the information that is delivered to them about the various entities that we were responsible for by a tier of a senior executive service career management. So basically, you're hearing a filtered source of information, much of which is what you are talking about has been dead wrong. A strategic plan that was flawed. The idea, and many of us, I included, have fought and continue to fight for the preservation of shortwave radio. It must be protected. Also trying to protect Russia, which we could have stopped. The question is, I think we have to look at the term of winning the hearts and minds. I'd throw that in the toilet. I would return and come back with a term called strategy. The other thing is, look, you can sit here and come up with wonderful ideas about what you would do in the future and how you would change it. There's a couple of things that you have to think about first. You have to go to the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee and encourage them to beef up the money, because figure this out. Do you know that China outspends us 8-1? That's not even figuring out how much Russia outspends us. So we're dealing with, what, $755 million to be able to run all these language services. And the most important thing, if I were going to tell you to go into right now to fix immediately in the Voice of America, is that newsroom. The newsroom is dysfunctional. It's operation. We can't even keep up with BBC. We were the last ones to talk about Ukraine. We were talking about little puff pieces. Look at the charter of the Broadcasting Board of Governors and the Voice of America and what our mission really is, what we're supposed to do. If you're going to fix it, you've got to have these guys and gals be able to do journalism. We have wonderful, wonderful journalists who have been serving in the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, in Marti, and they are being turned impotent. They are bullied. They are not allowed to do their job by a senior level tier that is crippling them. And I speak as a former governor, and I'm working behind the scenes to try to help them. The other thing is, you're talking about Russia and the Balkans and all of the Eastern European divisions. Yes, we have to focus on that, but if you're going to do strategy, if you're going to really play the game, then you have to think, who else is playing ball? When you think about Venezuela and you talked about Aló Presidente, who's there right now? The Russians, the Iranians, the Chinese, the Cubans. But the most important influence on the air right now, I'm influencing, because they have a media police, are the Russians. So we have to look at the map. I know I sound frantic about it because I do believe it's dysfunctional. But I think that if you and the great powers that you have, just even sitting there, and a lot of you here, with the voices and the connections that you have to some of the people in the House and the Senate, to be able to help And yeah, I know those board members, they're not perfect, but you're stuck with them right now. They're going to be hiring a CEO. You can help with that. You do not need to have someone coming in from CNN. You don't need to have someone with great corporate experience. You need to have people that come into the Broadcasting Board of Governors and be able to figure out the strategy of how to be able to save what you have and enhance what you have and get some money to boost it up and to get those careerists who are crippling and intimidating the talent that you have in there. And obviously, because they're government employees, just put them someplace else that's career Siberia so the place can function. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure we've got some responses from.
I'd just like to make one, as somebody who's very proud of having served much of his career in U.S. international broadcasting and who was utterly appalled by a number of decisions that were made above. I would just point to one of many. The outrageous decision to end shortwave on the assumption that we could do everything by AM or FM broadcasting. If you use AM and FM broadcasting, you have to be pretty close to your target audience, which generally means you have to be in the country that you were broadcasting to. Once you do that, you put yourself at risk. The first risk is even worse than being closed down. The first risk is people who say we mustn't take risks of criticizing these people because we might be closed down. And that happened. The fact is that the wholesale decision to rely on FM broadcasting locally in these countries put us at enormous risk. It was knowable in advance. People were told this. And the assumption was, to be blunt, that, well, in the United States, people listen to FM radio and they don't listen to shortwave. Therefore, it should be that wherever. We should, I believe, have FM broadcasting into some of these countries, but from neighboring countries, not in them. The minute you put a station on the ground under the control of any of these regimes, there's a risk. I think that that's the technology. Unfortunately, that was a huge strategic error, and that I would urge that in thinking about what needs to be done with U.S. international broadcasting, one start with the sort of technological underpinnings. That unless you can get your message to somebody, the message that you're going to worry about is all very interesting. Sometimes I know when I was at Radio Liberty in the late 80s, people said, well, you know, because we exist, that gives people in Washington feel-good time, and we could just pull the electric plug, save money, because it's our existence that matters, not getting the message there. Now, that was silly. I mean, people didn't really mean it. But you have to be able to reach your audience, and you have to have a technology that lets you do that. Internet is only so good. We need the kind of research about who listens and who doesn't. The fact is that there's some very good work that's being done by scholars at the Russian Academy of Sciences on how people use the internet and how different Russian internet use is from internet use in Germany or the West. That all needs to be factored in. But the decision to go to FM, I wanted to go to direct-to-home satellite TV broadcasting because, well, it's more expensive, and that was one of the things that was thrown up to those of us who made that argument. That is something that gets you out of being controlled or worse, subvertedly influenced by governments that can close you down when they want to. And that, I think one needs to look at the technology rather than on the who's preparing what news as the first stage to correcting the problem.
I think we've got.
Yes, I wanted to just comment on Blanquita Cullum's very apropos recommendation that we should be thinking about strategy. The problem here is that you cannot rely on the Broadcasting Board of Governors to be the innovators of American national strategy. American national strategy has to be run by the President of the United States, the National Security Council, and its component members, so the Secretaries of State and Defense, and the National Security Advisor, busy there serving those policymakers. And it has to be an integrated strategy that takes into account all of the different arts of statecraft. And the problem is that the BBG structure right now is completely divorced from national strategy. It is an orphan child, and it doesn't report to anybody in the executive branch and is not held accountable to anybody in the executive branch. And as a result, and the only time that that can possibly happen is if there just happens to be a very strong national security advisor who is ready to assume powers in competition with the Secretary of State, and if there just happens to be an NSC staffer who is ready to take on that entire broadcasting and public diplomacy portfolio, which there almost never is. And so this is why a structure where if you had a U.S. public diplomacy agency where its head was a Deputy Secretary of State, where within it you had our broadcasters, and I understand there are serious arguments about why the surrogate broadcasters should be an independent entity the way they were during the Cold War. I understand that. But I also believe that if there is that there can be some kind of arm's length arrangement with the surrogate broadcasters, even under the structure of a public diplomacy agency. I recommend that the director of that agency be a statutory member of the National Security Council, a statutory observer with the same rank in the NSC as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the director of national intelligence, who are statutory observers. And then, as they say, public diplomacy will be there at the takeoffs of policy and not just during the crash landings. And I think that the budgetary part of it, then if this agency, by the way, I conceive of having every public diplomatic function in the U.S. government essentially be put in it, including USAID, and people will argue with me, and it's a serious argument, and I take it, but even including the Peace Corps, which is another valuable instrument of American power, which is another orphan child that is not related to U.S. national strategy. And so I think that when we start thinking about these things strategically, and when people are forced to do so, and by the way, I also think that the funding problem needs to be solved, because these functions never get funded according to national strategic need. Never. And the only time anything does get funded according to national strategic need is in the Defense Department, which is why I recommend that we create a unitary defense and foreign affairs budget, which is a seamless garment of soft power and hard power, and all of it should be funded according to national strategic need. And that simply requires Congress to divide up its different nests, so to speak, in order to agree that this be done. Because I agree completely with Paul that soft power is our strong suit, and we should be able to exercise it much more skillfully with the right kind of funding in order to get this right.
Well, we're getting into a very deep. Well, Blankita, it's going to be have to be, because we're going to.
One of the things that I think is very important that you remember in this, and that is the function of the Broadcasting Board of Governors as a bipartisan board has actually worked in countries around the world where they have no freedom of speech, where they're shocked that you can have the right and the left come together on the issue of freedom of speech. The other thing to consider on the independence of that board is the fact that it is a journalistic entity, that it is not perceived as propaganda, because we protect that firewall of protecting that journalistic charter. That is one thing that I want you to
May I go ahead?
I think we're going to go to Ariel, and then we're going to go over here to David Inzer from Voice of America.
A couple of technology observations and a sort of government structure observation. First of all, it is difficult for me to envisage a 20-year-old in Russia, in Moscow today, for example, going out and buying a short wave radio in order to listen to the quality of content that Radio Liberty or Voice of America today provides. Maybe if the content was better, they would, but this is a technology that Paul and I and John remember, and people who grew up on Facebook and Twitter do not know what it is. So how you close the technology gap is a challenge. I think how you deploy these messages in Facebook and Twitter is an even bigger challenge. And who is going to do that when we are talking about creating a public diplomacy czar and we're going to create a public diplomacy czar, and some of the precedents with people from Madison Avenue who had no foreign policy background and were great advertisers for Uncle Ben's rice or some other products did not really cut it. And the numbers of undersecretaries for public diplomacy that came and went with no discernible impact suggest that not only we need to rethink the architecture, we need to rethink the resumes of these people. It is not an easy job to be able to combine the strategic outlook and understanding of the media. Finally, there's something to be said about the creativity of government employees. If we're talking about redesigning the same VOA and Radio Liberty and having government employees doing that on Twitter and Facebook, I think it'll be a tough slog to get these guys to talk to 20-year-olds in Beijing, Moscow, and especially in small towns around Russia, Ukraine, China, Afghanistan, and the Arab world.
Well, as we now get deeper and deeper into this discussion, I'd like to give David Enser, Director of Voice of America, a chance to give us his point of view and respond to some of all the many points that have been made.
Thank you very much, Ellie. It's great to be here discussing what I'm passionate about, and clearly everyone else in the room is, and that's America's soft power. And it's great to be in a room full of people who think we don't have enough of it and want more of it, because that's what the people who work at Voice of America also believe. The question is how to go about it. It may be that that President Putin has done us a favor in a weird way, in a perverse way, by his behavior of recent weeks. It may be that it will wake up Washington and cause people to think more about the need for well-funded, sustained soft power by the United States. I hope so, because I, like others in the room, so strongly believe in that and in the power of it if it's done right and funded right. There are a lot of different ways of, there's been a discussion here about how best to organize it. The existing board has recognized that the current structure is not what it should be, and has gone, with the President's approval, to the Congress and asked for a change. They've asked for a CEO-type structure. They've recognized that 9 part-timers, even with the best goodwill and best resumes and intentions, don't run a federal agency as well as one boss would. So I think it's really a discussion about how best to go forward, how to adequately fund and adequately lead U.S. Public diplomacy, and within that, broadcasting. And there are lots of different points of view. I don't agree with everything that members of the board, members of this panel have said, but there's a lot of wisdom that has been expressed in my view as well as someone who's a practitioner. Dr. Cohen, don't think that Voice of America is hobbling along. We reach, in fairness, with what we have, which is not a very large budget compared, as others have said, to RT and CCTV and others. I think we do remarkably well. We reach approximately 164 million people a week on one platform or another with news and information about the United States and its values and its society, which is highly valued. That's why 164 million people are interested in it. Former Governor Cullum said, and I think she's right, that there is the issue of journalism. What we do at Voice of America is journalism. The reason so many people want to hear us is because we do that, not propaganda. The Radio Moscow model, they had the biggest signal, shortwave signal in the world, incredibly powerful. Practically nobody listened to it because they had nothing to say that was of any interest. Voice of America does have things to say and has things to talk about because Voice of America talks about freedom of speech. We export the First Amendment. People care about that kind of thing. They're interested in what's really going on in the world, in an honest newscast. So I think as you talk about how to best to organize it, John Lanchowski, my friend from many years, my one criticism of the idea of presidential appointments running things, my concern about that is the firewall really has helped Voice of America and the other broadcasters. It allows us to have credibility, and credibility is the coin of the realm. That's how you build an audience, by being truthful. When we talk about the Abu Ghraib scandal that happened in Iraq, that was a stain on our own country's honor, and we do so honestly, we build audience, we build credibility. So honest journalism of the kind that America stands for is enormously powerful, and much more so than a propaganda operation run by political leaders could possibly be. So I think as you think and talk about that, it's important to keep that in mind. Perhaps I should stop there. Just on shortwave. I wish shortwave was the answer, but the statistics do not suggest it. As you said, Dr. Cohen, 20-year-olds in Moscow are not buying shortwave radios these days, and it's difficult to see how to get them to do so. How to go to the new type of shortwave that might work better. Can we get them to do that? Not clear. There are lots. The idea of direct-to-home satellite television, very appealing. A lot of discussion of that going on right now. With what's happening, possibly it needs a closer look. But the statistics suggest that while on the one hand, in the former Soviet space, there are quite a few people who have dishes, who might have access to buying dishes. In Russia itself, there are not many. So it is of interest. It's something we should look at, and perhaps in the coming period, that may be something that's done. The idea of Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania building some kind of a broadcast in Russian is a very appealing idea, and I do agree that that's something the United States should support. We could perhaps do a program for them. We could assist them in various ways. That would be a very interesting kind of collaboration that ought to be talked about going forward. Anyway, let me stop there, but in various criticisms of the Voice of America, look, we're grown-ups. We're fine with debate about what we do. We're passionate about what we do, those who work there now, and we're glad that there are people in town who are passionate about it too, because it's very, very important, and never more important than at a time when Russia seems to be acting up in Ukraine. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And Paul, you want
Two quick comments. First, I can't agree more with the idea that doing journalism is absolutely essential. The greatest impact that U.S. international broadcasting has had in a lot of the places I know about has come when we have reported things that the political elite of this country wasn't sure it wanted reported. I've talked to so many people who remember when VOA and Radio Liberty broadcast the Watergate hearings. And there were lots of people who were on the Hill and in the administration at the time who didn't want that to happen. But I remember the comment of one Latvian in Latgalia, which may matter more in coming weeks, that he said, if you live in a country, this was back in 1991, he said, if you live in a country where they bring down a president just for bugging in office, he said, that's a country I want to be part of. And I think there's a tendency to forget the extent to which those kinds of reports, which are often opposed by the political establishment, are very useful. The other thing I just would, because I spent my life looking at the periphery of countries, Moscow is not Russia. There is a tendency in our State Department and in this town to project whatever is true of Moscow and the country as a whole, because that's where we have the data. And that's where it's easiest to get the data, and that's where our embassy is, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at media consumption patterns in a place like, say, Sakha, which is the largest non-Russian republic in the Russian Federation, most people there, and this includes the 20-year-olds, rely on shortwave because the distances are so huge. that what's true in the periphery of the Russian Federation is very different than what's true in Moscow. And just because we have a government that tends to act as if Moscow is Russia, international broadcasters, it seems to me, should be aware that Russia is actually a country, and that a large part of it are people who have very different consumption patterns of the media than do the people in the center. I'm quite sure that, because I've been in contact with some of the people in Buryatia, that if you said tweet to them, they'd be as much at sea as I am with most of the new technology. Being old, I'm entitled not to understand things, but it's quite striking. And I would urge as strongly as I can, I think we need to take our friends in Moscow on, not just in Moscow, but in the enormous regions of the Russian Federation. I just wanted to mention one last point of many that we could say. You should all be aware that popular movements in 3 oblasts of the Russian Federation, and these are predominantly ethnic Russian regions, have called on Moscow to invade their oblasts because they believe that if the Russian military invaded their oblasts, they might have a chance of having as many rights as the Crimeans are supposed to get now that Russia has invaded them.
Kaylee, would you allow me one more comment? I'm sorry, I
Yes,
forgot to
yes,
say
go
one,
ahead.
I think, very important thing, which is that since Russia invaded Crimea, there have been a number of improvements and a number of efforts to up our game, if you will, by U.S. international broadcasting. I know our sister organization, Radio Free Europe, is working on overdrive. We also have been enormously in evidence on Ukrainian television. Channel 5 and other stations in Ukraine are using an enormous amount of VOA material. Our Ukrainian service is proudly working overtime, as is our Russian service, to have as much impact as possible. Our Ukrainian service has obtained some funding from the State Department and is about to hire a couple of people who are going to be working in the Russian language, broadcasting to eastern Ukraine with a perspective from the United States and from Ukrainians. So there are things that are being done. Some of them I don't want to discuss in detail because I don't think it's helpful. There's no point in telling our rivals and what we're up to. But there's a lot being done. More could be done if we had more funding. But we're not sitting still, and I think we're playing an important role, both in Ukraine, very much so, and increasingly we will look for ways to do more in Russia. It's true that Russia shut down many of our broadcasts. It is not true. The story that recently happened, the radio station in the suburbs of Moscow that was shut down, the AM, to be honest, that's a relatively minor development. I don't like it. It was a decision by the Kremlin. It lost us at most 1.5% of our audience in Russia. Our big play in Russia is digital, but we have other things that we're doing as well that I, as I say, don't want to go too much detail on. We're not without our ways of reaching the Russian people. And of course, with more resources, we could do even more.
Thank you. We have 2 people here. I owe you a comment. We're going to take 2 questions here. The lady green in the front and back here, and then I'm going to invite you all to make a closing comment. We're running a bit over time, but we have so much to say that I think that's definitely merited. So go ahead, ma'am.
My name is Angie Bowman. I'm from the International Committee for Crimea here in D.C. My question is going to change the topic of broadcasting, but perhaps it might be a good way to conclude. A week ago, I had a young lady at my house. We were just casually talking. She is from Crimea, and she's a Crimean Tatar who grew up in Crimea. She's a young woman, and her parents moved to Crimea when she was a child, so you know where she's coming from. She casually mentioned, she said, Russians don't have morals, but they have pride. I wonder whether you would like to comment on this.
Russia is just as diverse as any other nation. There are people among the Russians who have the highest morality going. Russia has given us many wonderful people, and it has given It has recently led a number of Russians to declare that their own government has engaged in a criminal enterprise in Ukraine. That Russians have, so I think that the first half of that sentence is not universally true. The second half, however, is terribly important, that you worry about pride when you're insecure about who you are. One of the elements, or one of the things that flows from the proposition I started my talk about, the relationship between the state and the nation, is that in states where the nation preexists the state, nationalism and state power tend to be countervailing forces. In other words, when people feel the state is at risk, their nationalism goes up, and when they feel the state is secure, nationalism goes down. The difference is evident from looking at how many American flags there were in neighborhoods on September 10th, 2001, as opposed to September 12th, okay? In a situation like the Russian Federation, however, state power and the sense of national identity track together. What that means is that when the state is very weak, national identity tends to be weak, and the state has to figure out a way to get things restarted. That's why Vladimir Putin orchestrated the killing of 300 Russians in 1999 and blamed it on the Chechens in order to restart his genocidal war against the Chechen nation in the North Caucasus. Let me finish one thought. That the problem is that when you get to a certain point, this nationalism focuses on pride alone, and it pushes forward policies that are dangerous and that feeds on each other, and that, I think, that half of the proposition of your friend is absolutely true.
Okay, let's have the last question up here, and then we'll all have a chance to comment.
Thanks very much. Dan Robinson, I'm a former White House correspondent, as recently as 6 or 7 weeks ago. Nice to see David here. Thanks to Helly. I'll just make a few points, because now I'm able to speak in public in ways I wasn't able to speak when I was correspondent and worked for that organization for 35 years.
For Voice of America?
Right. VOA has been hobbling along, very clearly hobbling along. I and others made a specific effort over the last few years to bring to the attention of the outside world things that the public relations apparatus of VOA and to an extent the BBG didn't want to discuss, and in recent months actually responded to with defensiveness and with arrogance. Other parts of the BBG, perhaps you all saw the RFERL, the surrogate live TV shots on the internet websites. You might not be able to say that about other parts of the BBG structure. Anyway, I won't go into too much detail. If anyone wants to talk to me about the many ways I saw VOA hobbling along in a range of coverage issues, including in the digital realm, you can contact me by phone or email. But I wanted to make a point which is related to what Blankita was saying, and which you discussed also to John and Paul especially, and Ariel, which is to ask, how would you see the relationship changing between the journalists who work for Voice of America and other organizations and who operate under their own form of charters, as the VOA still does under its own charter, changing as journalistic reporters and correspondents at these places? I can tell you very, very clearly that if VOA was declared to be have oversight of the NSC, there would be exclamation points going off in the White House Correspondents Association, and I, in my opinion, think there should be valid questions asked as to whether there should be a White House correspondent representing the VOA. Now, if the goal is to take down the billboards on various bureaus for VOA around the world and overseas bureaus and replace them with BBG, that's another thing. But I think that's a very important question, and it's one I'd be interested in hearing from you, because there are many people, many journalists at VOA who got there from the beginning, and many who came in, who do not see themselves working under any foreign policy structure or being seen by their colleagues as being attached to, let's say, the NSC, the White House, maybe less so at the Pentagon and State Department. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. I think I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Thank you.
Let me just observe here, I have never advocated that the Voice of America should do anything that could be construed as propaganda. It has never done that. It has never been charged with doing that. Nobody wants that. And every once in a while, we know that a Secretary of State or somebody else may call up the director of the VOA and tell them to try to censor a broadcast, which has happened in the past. But for most of its history, the Voice of America worked as part of the United States Information Agency, which was a separate agency that reported ultimately to the White House under guidance from the State Department, because USIA did not make policy, but was subject to State Department policy. I don't think the United States needs to have a government-funded CNN. We need good journalism there, that's right, but this is simply not a state journalistic enterprise. The Voice of America is part of the foreign policy of the United States, and it does so by speaking the truth. But and one can be completely objective about how one reports these things, but there are, as everybody knows, there are different editorial ways of presenting objective news. There are headlines, there are photographs, there are editorials. And the VOA has an editorial office which defends the policies of the United States, and somebody needs to do that in the world. Somebody needs to defend those policies, and CNN doesn't do it. And so there's no argument here. I think that there is room for a bipartisan board like the BBG, but not exercising executive power. The model that works well was that which was exercised by the old Board for International Broadcasting before it became a governing board. It was an oversight board. It was bipartisan, and it made its business was to hire experts who didn't have equities in diaspora politics or the factional politics of a given country, and they'd find some professor at the University of Nebraska who spoke the language fluently and would listen to 2 months worth of programming over Radio Free Europe, some language service, and find out whether that broadcasting was tendentious, whether it was biased in favor of one faction or another, whether it was pushing a given agenda. And by the way, for the surrogate radios, those need not be quote unquote consistent with U.S. foreign policy. They need to be not inconsistent with U.S. foreign policy, and there's a difference there. It's a strategic difference, and one can have an arm's length arrangement with that kind of an outfit, but all of these are nevertheless part of the foreign policy of the United States, and they have to be understood that way. Let me just make one thing also about technology. I think that that every single venue of trying to reach foreign audiences has to be attempted, whether it's AM, FM, shortwave, cell phones, satellites. I remember when we were in the NSC, we discovered that Soviet televisions had UHF channels built into them, and that were not being used. And if we had a satellite that broadcast over UHF, they could pick it up directly on their TVs with a normal antenna without a dish. There are then in shortwave there's a technological revolution. It's called DRM, Digital Radio Mondiale. And you can not only broadcast voice over it, you can broadcast text and video. And who's going to get themselves a DRM receiver? Well, the people who find that there's a good signal being sent, and we could flood the world with cheap DRM receivers, and some people will get them, and they can listen to this stuff or watch it anonymously, which is, and with regard to audience statistics, and I just want to say, David Ensor, I think that what the Voice of America does and what you do has been nothing short of heroic in the strategic environment of neglect of soft power by several administrations, and this is a bipartisan problem. I think that, but I would say, I would even caution you, if I may say so, to not sell yourself short when it comes to audience statistics. If there is a single monk in a Buddhist monastery in Tibet listening to the Voice of America secretly in the basement of that monastery, and then he tells the relevant piece of news to all the rest of the monks in his monastery, and then all the pilgrims come into that monastery from all around the country and then go back to their villages, is that an audience of one or is it an audience of thousands? I'm not quite sure, but when there is good, relevant information that affects the lives of people, yes, sometimes it can be distorted when one says to another and says to another, etc. But I think the strategic effect is there, and I think that the VOA has a bigger effect than your modest statistics even would reveal. So anyway, those are just a few thoughts.
Okay, Paul, any closing thoughts?
One thought to build on that. Other than my wife, my closest friend in the world was Leonard Mary of Estonia. Leonard delivered the address at the formal creation of the BBG. And one of the things that Leonard Mary was very proud of is that he had in his archive a set of books, of notebooks, in which he had recorded every single day from 1950 until 1988 his ability to listen or not listen to Western broadcasters like the Voice of America, like Deutsche Welle, like Radio Vatican, like Radio Liberty or Radio Free Europe Estonian Service. Because he saw that as his lifeline to the world. One of the things that, and I think John's talking about splash is very important. The splash effect is bigger than many people imagine. But there is also something related to it, and that is, it is the long-term thing. It is not, as many people seem to think in this country, a short-term question of covering this or that event. It is developing the kind of confidence that you can only do by broadcasting over and over and over again for many, many years and be known for accuracy. It is hard to develop a reputation. It is easy to lose it. The firewall is critical. Journalism is critical, and that which is commentary needs to be labeled very carefully. Good journalism, I've always thought that we should act with confidence in the double sense, and we often act as if we are not confident. The first confidence is the truth is definitely on our side, not on the other side, so we have every interest in putting out accuracy, even if it makes us look bad that moment, because in the long term, the truth is more important, and ultimately it works to our benefit. The second is that I definitely believe, and it's related to this, that the solution to bad information is in almost every case more information. It is having good information. One of the reasons it's been mentioned that Soviet broadcasting did so badly is that there were alternative sources that people could see just how bad it really was. It is critically important that those sources be there all the time. And now with a Russian government that, shall we say, is only loosely connected to the truth most of the time, and to its facilitators in the West who are willing to allow it to lie and not challenge it, truth works for us. One last thought, and then I'll shut up. I worked half of my life in international broadcasting for the United States government, and I'm very proud of that. But the proudest moments I had were when I was working for Secretary Baker at the end of 1990 and the beginning of 1991, working with the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union and the occupied Baltic states. And during that period, there was no money in the State Department budget to take these leaders around from these places when they came to Washington. And so it was left to me to take them around in my old yellow Volvo. And I had a carefully plotted strategy because there were things that you definitely wanted them to see. But of the 11 heads of government or chiefs of state, of the 15 soon-to-be countries that I took around to these, it is striking that all 11 asked to have their photograph taken in the first instance, not where most people in this room would imagine, in front of the White House or the State Department or the Washington Monument or the Kennedy grave. All 11 of them wanted to be taken, have their picture taken in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, because somehow they had heard, via, I'm sure, U.S. international broadcasting, that on the lintel of that building there is the inscription, "Equal justice under law." And that's what they thought they were about. That was incredible. It was a moving thing every time this happened. And my favorite example was when the former head of the Communist Party apparatus in one of these countries, with his bouffant hair, was busily combing it in the rain and the wind so that they would have a good picture of him in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. And I say thank you, VOA, for doing that.
Ariel, any parting thoughts?
I think what we learned today, and there was plenty of both historic and current political material here, is how important international broadcasting and public diplomacy is. And gosh, I've been in this town for 21 years, and sometimes it feels that there were no lessons learned from our tremendous victory in the Cold War through soft power. When I was a kid in Radio Liberty Audience Research, we were saying that international broadcasting is worth 1/2 of one aircraft carrier, and the results were tremendous. We need to rethink it. And no, it is not your grandfather's central broadcasting authority. It is a much, much more fluid and dispersed world. And as somebody who grew up listening to VOA, to BBC and Radio Liberty as a kid in Russian, I can tell you that the products are different. The competition is much more fierce. The content is much more entertaining and competitive. It's much more interrelated. I am addicted to the Russian Facebook, and references to the Game of Thrones, to Sex and the City, to things like that are permeating the Russian discourse on Facebook and outside of Facebook. It's a new ball game in the sense of that the content is different, the technology is different, but the strategic purposes remain the same. These are both tools to influence how we think, how other people think. Other people understand it in many cases better than we do. I think the Russians do understand soft power better than we do, exactly as a tool of geopolitical competition. But I agree with John Lenchovsky that this is something we can be very good at. We just, at this moment in history, we're not as good. And what does it take to bring us back to the leading position, to the leading, becoming once again the leading power? I think this is a challenge to all of us and to the administrations to come. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much to our wonderful panel, and thanks to all of you for coming and for this great discussion.